More Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 2. Miss Angel and the Dancer. It was the year 1771 in Rathfarnam Castle, just outside the city of Dublin. The sounds of harpsichord music echoed through the empty ballroom. Seated at the keyboard was an elegant woman of 30 years of age. She was a very skilled player, and she was playing a sonata by Scarlatti. The sheets of music spread out before her on a lyre-shaped wooden stand attached to the instrument. She gave herself up to the music energetically, smiling to herself at her own spirited rendition of the piece. It had not always been so, she reflected with a pang of regret. In the past few years in London, she had had little energy for art, let alone music, and her old father had worried about her. But now, this trip to Dublin, unexpected as it had been, was rejuvenating her. She woke up each summer morning thankful to be alive and to be able to create. And she worked with her old élan on several projects, still finding time to play the harpsichord every day, often for herself here in the ballroom where it stood, or often too for the Loftus family and their guests after a fine candlelit dinner. The woman playing the harpsichord all alone in the ballroom of Rathfarnam Castle was Angelika Kauffmann, known to all and sundry in the fashionable world as Miss Angel. The name had been given to her by some early admirer in London. Now she had been invited by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Townshend, to visit Dublin for 6 months and execute commissions for himself and other members of the Anglo-Irish nobility. Among these was Henry Loftus, the master of Rathfarnam Castle. He wanted a family portrait of the Loftuses, like she had done for Lord Townshend already. He also wanted parts of the castle decorated, walls and ceilings to be designed by her. She was now a guest of the Loftus family at their country seat outside Dublin. Lord Loftus was often away in the city during the day and didn't return till evening. His family had their own pursuits, so she had plenty of time to herself, and she used it to nurture the gifts of art and music within her. Having played a few Scarlatti sonatas, she looked at what other music she had. There were suites by Handel, rather old-fashioned music by London standards, for London now favoured Christian Bach and musicians in the newer style. She was not surprised to find Handel's music still played here in Dublin. To tell the truth, she liked this old music, and leafing through the book, she found a languid slow movement that seemed to recreate the mood of those times, and she began to play it. Then, after a pause, she picked out a stately dance. It should not be played too fast, she knew, to give the dancers of them days time to perform their intricate steps. She was so preoccupied with putting in the trills which this style of music required that she didn't look up for a while. But then she had a feeling she was no longer alone. Glancing up from the keyboard, she became aware of a shadowy figure, hard to make out in the unlit gloom of the ballroom. It was a young woman, dancing by herself out on the polished floor. She was dancing a stately dance, the dance Angelica was playing. Angelica smiled uncertainly, but she kept on playing till the end of the piece, even doing repeats of the sections. The unknown dancer danced along with her playing. Who could this be, she wondered? One of the Loftus family? Some visitor she had not met? She played to the end. Then she looked up. The woman was gone. Despite the sunny afternoon outside, she felt a strange chill. She stood up. She would play no more today. Actually, she should go upstairs now to the salon which Henry Loftus wanted her to decorate. It would be something mythological, with nymphs and cupids. Something fairly conventional. She doubted if Henry Loftus or his family would be interested in the kind of style she was developing, a bold play of light and shadow on the figures, which she had used in the family portrait for Lord Townshend. She sighed. As the years went by, she thought, her vision had forsaken the sunny optimism she had known in Italy. She was now seeing darker spaces, and figures moving enigmatically within them. She knew darkness now. It had come to her in London in the shape of... But what was the use thinking about that? She had so much new work to do, each project a challenge. The following afternoon, Angelica sat in the empty, shadowy ballroom again, and again she played from the Handel suites. She found various dance pieces to play, titled Allemande, Courante, Gigue, or Contradanse. When she looked up from her playing, she was only half surprised to see the graceful figure of the young woman dancing out on the floor, far away from her. When she stopped playing, the dancer seemed to pause in the shadows, waiting for the next dance to begin. When she played a new piece, the dancer would emerge and dance again. She knew all the steps to all the dances, apparently. Who could she be? Angelica wondered again. Perhaps this was someone she should know. She would speak to her. When she got to the end of all the pieces she felt like playing, she closed the lid of the keyboard with a determined gesture, turned to look out into the ballroom, and said, "Madame!" The dancer seemed to fade suddenly into the shadows. Angelica stood up. Again she called, "Madame!" But the sound of her voice just echoed in the empty ballroom. She walked the length of the room and back again, looking in every direction, but she realized she was now alone. Only the sound of her own footsteps came back to her, breaking the oppressive silence. Now this was something of a mystery. She wanted to get to the bottom of it. She guessed that this young woman had something to tell her, or she herself had something to tell this woman. On going out of the ballroom, she had asked several servants if they had seen this lady going in or out, but none had any useful information they could give her. Angelica returned to the ballroom next afternoon. Her resolve deepened. She would capture the elusive figure. She would make her speak to her. But she must be gentle and forbearing with this shy creature. She would draw her in. What they had in common was music, she reasoned, so she must use her music to draw this person in, like Orpheus with his lyre, taming the wild creatures. She played her usual repertoire of dance pieces, and the young woman was out there, making her practice dance movements on the ballroom floor. Finally, Angelica began to play a slow piece, which she liked, because it seemed to have a hidden melancholy about it, and this melancholy seemed to emerge from the notes as you worked your way through the piece. You were left with a feeling of indefinable sadness. This music seemed predestined to echo in an empty room. She played it slowly, getting all the expression out of the notes, lingering over the trills. Looking up, she saw that the figure had paused, motionless out on the floor. She was listening. Instead of retiring into the shadows on the walls, she edged gradually closer. When Angelica finished, and when the music died away, she was standing behind her. Angelica sensed her presence there now. Again she felt a strange chill in the air. She sat with her head bowed meditatively over the keyboard, longer than was necessary. Then she turned around slowly. A young woman was standing motionless about 6 feet from her. Her pale face was framed by dark brown hair. She was quite a beauty, this young woman. Yet she was younger than Angelica had expected, surely no more than a girl of 20. Her hands hung limp by her sides. She was wearing a formal blue silk gown, but an oddly old-fashioned one. It looked like the sort of gown that fine ladies had worn in Angelica's childhood. Angelica looked at her in wonderment, her eyes taking in all these details. The young woman calmly returned her gaze. The silence had gone on too long for politeness, Angelica thought. "You dance so well," she said with a smile. "I was glad to play for you." "You play well," said the young woman, and her voice seemed to come from infinite distances. "You know all the good dances." Whether from the chill or the strange atmosphere in the unlit ballroom, Angelica felt light-headed, like as if she was in a dream. "I play what I find here," she said vaguely, gesturing to the pile of music books nearby. "The Loftus family have a good collection of music. There's certainly plenty of old music." "And I like to dance," said the young woman in her languid voice. "It's my only freedom. Can you understand that?" Angelica nodded, even though she was not at all sure what was meant. "I come to the ballroom every day and every night, hoping that there will be an orchestra here to play for me. But there never is, not now. So I walk around the room and feel a bit free that way. Seldom does somebody come here to play on the harpsichord, as you do." "Tell me your name, miss, I pray you," said Angelica. "Though I have been in Rathfarnam for a while, I do not believe I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance." Without further ado, she stood up from the keyboard. "I am Catherine Watkins, at your service, ma'am," said the young woman, and curtsied. "Angelika Kauffmann, the artist," said the other, also with a curtsy. The young woman looked at her blankly. She clearly did not know who she was. Were there people in the house who did not know of her? "Are you one of the Loftus family, or a neighbour, perhaps?" Angelica asked. The young woman shook her head sadly. "No, I am not a relative of the Loftuses. I just came here for the ball, and never left. You see, I am bound to this place. I am always here." She smiled sadly now. Angelica, for her part, found the beautiful creature far too melancholy for her liking. She knew what it was like to be melancholy. She had known it these past few years in London, and it was not good. Life was for living, not for moping about. She was glad the young woman enjoyed dancing. Let her dance then, by God, she thought. "Shall I play for you some more, Miss Watkins?" she asked. "It seems to me that music does you good, and I would be more than pleased to see you dance and smile." "Aye, that would please me well, ma'am," was the reply. "But first let me hear a slow piece from the heart, like the one you just played. for I can tell that you have a heart." Their eyes met. "Your obedient servant," said Angelica lightly, and sat down at the keyboard. Among her music books she found a piece called Sarabande and began to play it. The young woman came and listened, like a shy animal drawn to a stream, and she stood by the open lid of the harpsichord, sometimes gazing down at the movement of the strings, sometimes looking at the player, and then their eyes would meet, and each would glimpse the soul of the other, and it was as if time stood still. Angelica finished the sarabande. They looked at each other again. "Oh, well done," said the young woman fervently now. "I like that sadness and grief as much as I like dancing." "Well, now let there be a truce to sadness," said Angelica, determinedly looking through her music book. "Let us have something to make young missus want to dance." She embarked on a dance movement. Her companion glided away from the harpsichord, out into the ballroom, and began a graceful dance to Angelica's tune. When Angelica was done, she went on to another sprightly dance, and was just dimly aware of the graceful figure moving about on the ballroom floor. To lift the remaining heaviness from her own heart, Angelica played the whole Handel suite through, and when she was done, she did not need to raise her head from the keyboard and look out into the great room to know she was alone. A few days later, she was there again. She played as the afternoon sunlight streamed into the empty ballroom, and the figure in the blue gown danced in and out of the light and shadow. At the end, Angelica played a slow, solemn piece, and as if by agreed convention, the figure glided near, till she loomed over the strings of the open harpsichord, and they looked at one another. Angelica said, "My dear Miss Watkins, allow me to ask you, are you betrothed, or is there some young gentleman courting you? I have not seen one. Yet a dancer needs a partner, and a good dancer like you deserves a good partner." She smiled, looking at the younger woman quizzically, with her head on one side. "You might say I was betrothed. You might say I had two partners, not one. Two young gentlemen claimed my hand, for I was the belle at the ball." "I dare say you were," said Angelica with another smile. "So how did the story end?" "It came to no good end," replied Catherine Watkins shortly, and looked away. There was a silence, and then Catherine said, "And what of you, ma'am? Are you married? I suppose you are." "Yes and no," said Angelica. "I was married, for a few days or a week. Then the marriage was finished. That too came to no good end. But surely you have heard of my misfortunes. They were the talk of London, and I'm sure talk has preceded me to Dublin." Catherine shook her head. "I know none of this. But then I have not talked to anyone in a long time. You were the first." "You pay me too much honour, miss," said Angelica. "But you see now, talk is like dancing. It takes two." "So does marriage," she added somewhat bitterly. "Poor lady," said Catherine wonderingly. "Surely someone of your condition and accomplishments deserves better. Why did things go badly, if I may make so bold as to ask?" "The man I married was not the person he gave himself out to be," said Angelica with a sigh. "He sought and won my hand under entirely false pretences. Then, when I was better informed and would not go with him, he and his servants came with a coach and four in the middle of the night and sought to abduct me. But my father's servants drove them off. Such was my marriage, miss." "You're greatly to be sympathized with, dear lady, and I'm the one to do it, I assure you, for I too have had great misfortune." "No doubt you can, miss, and your ready sympathy touches my heart. But pray, let us not burden ourselves with such gloomy matters. I, for one, prefer to hear sparkling, witty talk, and even better, music." She turned to the keyboard again. "But I fear you must find it lonesome or boring to dance to my music without a partner. You must imagine some ethereal dancing partner doing the steps with you." Catherine shook her head. "Have no such care, ma'am. I have learned to dance alone. In fact, I am never so free as when I dance now. I dance better than I did with a partner, as you shall see, if you play for me." Angelica looked through the music books and found a lively dance. As she played, she saw Catherine spin out onto the dance floor and dance gracefully to the music. She danced uncommonly well, it was true. That inspired Angelica to play with even more zest and abandon, and at the end of half an hour's playing, she found herself reflecting that she in her own life was doing the same thing as Catherine Watkins now, dancing without a partner. And how well and how tirelessly she danced, between painting and music, between Italy, London and Dublin. The music trailed off when she came to the end of the last piece. Now the silence and the chill enveloped her. She was again alone in the great ballroom. That evening she dined with the Loftuses as usual, and later on, as they were sitting by the fireside in their drawing-room, Angelica asked, "Who is that young lady I see in the ballroom? You know her, I take it." There was a sudden silence. Lord Loftus looked at her quizzically, then frowned. "My dear Miss Kauffmann, not you too," he exclaimed. Angelica was mute with surprise at this reaction. "So you have seen the young lady in the ballroom," he said, with a tone approaching exasperation. Then his good humour got the better of him. "Pray tell," he chuckled, "have you seen the dog as well? The dog in the night time?" Lady Loftus shook her head at this. "Enough of such talk, Henry. You are alarming our guest. See how pale she looks, the poor dear. Pray forgive us, Miss Kauffmann. We are only too aware of what it was you saw, I'm afraid. So is everyone in the house." "Come, Henry," she said, turning to her husband. "Now you will have to regale our guest with the whole story, though God knows it is not a happy one. And yes, put in the dog for good measure." Angelica thought it best just to sit back in her armchair and await this revelation. Lord Loftus puffed on his pipe for a moment. "My dear Miss Kauffmann," he began, "you must first hear something about the fortunes of this house. It always belonged to the Loftuses. The original walled castle was built by a Loftus in the time of Queen Elizabeth. But about 100 years ago, it seems one heir was very improvident and had to sell the estate to pay off debts he had incurred through gambling or some such nonsense. So the Loftuses had to live elsewhere in Dublin for a time. The house passed through several hands. One new owner decided to give a great ball and invited all the best society in Dublin. He hired an orchestra and laid on a banquet, and there was music and dancing till well after midnight. That was in the year of grace 1741. Angelica started. "Good God," she exclaimed, "that is the very year I was born." "Indeed," said Lord Loftus politely, though he did not really follow. "That explains everything," she went on quietly. "What does it explain?" asked Lady Loftus, equally puzzled. "Oh, forgive me," said Angelica. "I was distracted for a moment. Pray continue with your story, Lord Loftus." "It was a fine evening, it was, that ball. and it was long remembered in Dublin," went on her host. "Of course, it was a great time for the amorous young people among the gentry to meet. Now, among these were two young men, Richard Usher and Thomas Stapleton, who had each taken a strong fancy to a young woman attending the ball. Her name was Catherine Watkins." Angelica grew very pale and closed her eyes for a moment, but in the semi-darkness by the fireside no one seemed to notice. "She was a singular beauty by all accounts, and the two young men were ardent rivals," went on Lord Loftus. "They were both in a position to offer her marriage, and neither would give way to the other. They were hot-blooded young men, and instead of laying the matter before their families, they arranged to fight a duel, of which they told no one. The winner of the duel was to marry the young lady. Winner take all, you might say. It was a mighty foolish business. But, as I say, the two young men were sworn to secrecy, so no one of any sense could intervene. On the evening of the ball, the two rivals and their seconds slipped away from the reception and met in a barn off to the side of the castle. There were a few flaming torches to give light. The pistols were presented, for that is what they had agreed on. The terms were 6 paces. The two rivals stood back to back and walked their 6 paces away from one another, so that they were 12 paces apart. Then they turned and fired. It was an ill-starred business, because Stapleton got in a direct shot to Usher's head, which killed him, but not before Usher had let off a shot which entered Stapleton's body. The seconds ran to attend to each man, who now lay slumped on the ground. They found Usher already dead, his eyes staring out from under a great wound in his forehead. Stapleton was alive. They raised him to his feet, and at this point he told them he was only slightly wounded. They would have called a surgeon from nearby, but he insisted that first he must go and tell this Catherine he had won the duel and would marry her. Then he would have his wound seen to. Whereupon he walked out of the barn, leaving the 2 seconds with the body of Usher. Stapleton was on his way into the castle when he must have felt faint and realized he could not go on in his wounded state. It seems he turned aside to go to his coach, where he knew his servant was waiting. He had to walk along the edge of the pond just behind the castle, but he must have been so faint he fell into the water and sank several feet. The splash of his body hitting the water and his feeble attempts to right himself were heard, but not by his servant, but by his dog, which was at the coach waiting. Animal instinct must have told him his master was in peril, and the faithful hound ran to the spot, jumped in, and tried to pull his body out. But he could not, and soon drowned himself. Some other servants were attracted by the commotion, and soon Stapleton's body was recovered and identified. Whether he had succumbed to his wounds, a ball had passed near his heart, as the surgeons were able to establish, or whether he had drowned in the few feet of water, no one could say for sure. Anyway, neither of the two survived the duel. It had all been in vain. "What about Catherine Watkins?" asked Angelica in a whisper. Lord Loftus puffed on his pipe. "That's the deuced strange thing. She disappeared. No one had actually seen her at the ball, and no one ever saw her again. Not her family, nor anyone else. Of course, there were rumours and conjectures aplenty. Some said she had fled to England and taken a new name, or even gone out to the American colonies. And then, years later, I think, she began to be seen by people, usually down in the ballroom. Even still, people get a glimpse of her every so often. The servants see her. And we have seen her, haven't we, my dear?" Lady Loftus touched the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief and nodded sadly. Then she brightened a bit. "Don't forget the dog, Henry," she told her husband. "Ah, yes, the dog," exclaimed Lord Loftus, puffing vigorously on his pipe. "It seems that they see the dog too, the one who drowned trying to save his master. It seems he prowls disconsolately around the old pond at night, looking for the unfortunate young Stapleton. He has been seen by many. Can't say I've seen him myself, but I've never really looked for him. Anyway, that's the story of the ill-fated ball, Miss Kauffmann. Later on, a relative of mine was able to buy the Rathfarnam estate back, and we Loftuses have lived in peace here ever since." The next day, after a morning spent working on her designs for the salon upstairs, it took all of Angelica's courage to go down to the deserted ballroom, for she now knew she was dealing with a person who was not of this world. She could feel the chill already as she sat down before the harpsichord. She began to play a Handel slow movement. After a while, she noticed a figure gliding soundlessly up the room, to stand about 6 feet behind her. She finished playing. Without turning round, she said, "Catherine, I want to help you." "How can you help me?" asked the now familiar voice. "I want to free you from this dreadful imprisonment that seems to bind you. I want you to be able to go on into the light of heaven, even if it means I never see you again, not in this world." "I wander about," said Catherine. "I dance when someone plays for me. I am not imprisoned. Not now, not here, as I am." Angelica turned slowly around and looked at the pale figure standing close to her in the shadows. "I know about you now, Catherine. I have heard the story, as they tell it still. I know about the duel and the 2 young men, Usher and Stapleton, who were rivals for your hand. But why did you disappear afterwards? Where did you go?" "I went nowhere. I took poison." "Good God, why?" "I had little to say in the rivalry. I was caught between them. If I had to choose, I would have taken poor Richard Usher. He was a good boy. Stapleton was older than him, and was a wild fellow, a brute, always gambling at cards and getting into fights. He was an experienced enough duellist, both with sword and pistol. When he and Richard Usher quarrelled over me, he was the one to propose settling it by a duel, and Richard foolishly accepted. I guessed he had no chance. Stapleton boasted to me that I would be his prize. As I waited for the duel to be over, I knew it could only have one issue. I could no longer bear to think of him coming to tell me he had Richard Usher's blood on his hands, and that because of that I must now be his. They had given me laudanum, so I could remain calm and quiet. I waited a long time, and the longer I waited and no one came, the surer I was that Stapleton had won. So I took the rest of the laudanum at one gulp, and that was the merciful end of it." "Poor girl," groaned Angelica. "No one came, because Usher and Stapleton were both dead. They killed each other with their gunshots." Catherine bowed her head and did not look up for a long time. Angelica could tell she was weeping. "Be free now," said Angelica at last, though she herself could hardly bring out the words. "You were not to blame." "Oh, but I was, and I am," said Catherine. If they are both dead, as you say, then they died for me, because of me. Unhappy creature that I am, I have caused the deaths of 2 men, not just one." "No," protested Angelica. "You did not tell them to duel over you. You did not pull the triggers. You killed no one. Your hands are not stained with blood." "Oh, but they are," wailed Catherine loudly now. "I was a part of this madness. I was the centre of it. I liked being fought over." "You are a mere girl," said Angelica. "All of us get caught up in this kind of foolishness. And as long as there are men and women in the world, I feel it will be ever thus." "If there is no hope, if it will ever be thus," said Catherine, "then I want no truck with the world, and will go back where I came from." "No," said Angelica, "remain but a while with me, and I will show you a better way." "What way?" "A way of joy. Music, art, beauty. All these things are a foretaste of heaven. These are what I live for. I paint, I draw, I design, I create, I sing, I make music." "Not I." "But you are a very good dancer." "Perhaps, but now I have lost the wish to dance." "You mean well, ma'am, but there is no such way for me. And now all that's said and done is said and done. Ma'am, I take my leave of you." She curtsied, turned, and walked rapidly and gracefully down the ballroom, her footfalls making no sound in the chilly silence. "Catherine!" Angelica called. But she knew she was now alone. On many days after that, Angelica went to the ballroom and played everything from Handel to Scarlatti and Christian Bach, but the dancer never came forth from the shadows again. It was the last night before Angelica's departure from Dublin. Tomorrow she would be brought by coach to the Liffey Quays and would board a ship for England. As she often had before, she sat with the Loftuses in front of a fire in their private drawing-room. "Well, my dear Miss Kauffmann," said Lord Loftus, puffing on his pipe, "it only remains for us to thank you for all you have done here, and still more for your enjoyable company, which we shall miss." "Indeed," said Lady Loftus from the other side of the hearth, "your visit brought a breath of fresh air, as one might expect from someone who lives and works in London." "Ah, yes," said Angelica, "I shall miss all the friends I have made here in Dublin, and most of all your hospitable selves." "We hope, dear Miss Kauffmann," said Lady Loftus, "that we were able to provide you with enough company and entertainment of polite society, so that you do not grow bored or melancholy, as people sometimes do here. I assure you I have remained in good spirits in your excellent company, and that of your friends and acquaintances." "By the way," said Lord Loftus, with a thoughtful puff on his pipe, "I have been meaning to ask you, did you see the ghost of the dancer in the ballroom again?" Angelica looked sad and wistful for a few moments. "After a certain point I saw her no longer, and no matter what I played, she did not appear. You see, she used to come out of the shadows and dance when I played the harpsichord down there." Lord and Lady Loftus exchanged surprised glances. "In fact," Angelica went on, wringing her hands in her lap, "I fear I drove her away with all my talk. But it was well meant." "Talk?" echoed Lord Loftus incredulously. "Are we to understand that you conversed with this young lady?" "Aye, my lord, I did," said Angelica with a sigh. "I did not mention it previously, for I feared it might alarm you, and make you think I had taken leave of my senses." "So you did speak together, both of you?" asked Lord Loftus. "I will not deny it, since your lordship has asked," said Angelica. "She told me of her sadness, which I tried to soothe with music. We also came to speak of the duel and its outcome. She did not seem to know the 2 young men were both dead, and I fear she was more afflicted as a result than she had been before. I tried to persuade her to seek the peace of heaven, as every Christian should, but in the end I could not console her, and she quit my sight. I have not seen her since then, which was more than a month ago." Lord and Lady Loftus looked at each other in mute wonderment. "Amazing," said Lord Loftus finally, with a puff on his pipe. "Truly amazing." "It does not completely surprise me, Henry," said Lady Loftus after a while. "Miss Kauffmann, as we hear, is known as Miss Angel in London, and this name honours her on account of the wonder of her art, her painting, but also because of the charm and sincerity of her person. She is indeed angelic, and it is this, perhaps, that enables her to pass between this world and the world of spirits, communicating with each. Is it not perhaps so, my dear?" she said, turning to Angelica. "I fear your ladyship does me too much honour," was the reply. "Yet I must admit that I seem fated to know all the sadness of the world, as well as its joys, and I must accept the strange encounters it sometimes brings me." "Well, there you are, Miss Kauffmann," said Lord Loftus, gazing into the glowing embers of the fire. "This house has known plenty of both in its time. Joy and sorrow, I mean. Living here for years now, we have the feeling that the house remembers these things and wants to remind us of them." He looked up at Angelica and smiled. "I believe you will remember your sojourn at Rathfarnam Castle." As the clocks were striking 11, Angelica rose to go, and was escorted to her rooms upstairs by a servant with a candle. Their footfalls on the staircase echoed through the great house. When Angelica was alone, she paused a long time in thought. Finally, she went to her window, attracted by the sight of a full moon in the night sky. She looked out. The gardens of the castle stretched out as far as the walls of the estate, next to the high road, and the bright light of the moon showed the lawn, the flower beds, the pond which reflected the moonlight, and a dark clump of trees behind it. Within these trees she saw a movement of some sort, and waited to see what it was. She caught her breath. It was a dog, a large pale dog that was walking around the edge of the pond, pausing every so often to look out on the water. After a while, he disappeared from sight. But Angelica had seen him, and all alone in her rooms, just before midnight, she shivered. Then she leaned her head against the window, and the view of the castle gardens in the moonlight was blurred with tears. I grew up not 3 miles from Rathfarnam Castle. In Victorian days, the last Anglo-Irish owner had sold the place to the Jesuits, who used it as a novitiate for nearly a century. They commissioned some artwork themselves, but it was religious. In fact, they took down the paintings by Angelika Kauffmann on the ceiling of the salon upstairs and replaced them with a set of scenes from the life of Christ. The house and grounds were eventually sold by the Jesuits, who no longer needed a novitiate, and it was acquired by the Irish government, who made it into a national monument. Now you could take a guided tour of the interior, and I did. There I heard all the old stories about the castle. In particular, I heard about the skeleton in the closet. I was shown the closet where the skeleton was found. Now, this happened in the year 1880, when the last noble family was living there, that of Lord Blackburn. On opening this long unused closet one day that year, servants found the skeleton of a woman in a beautiful silk dress belonging to the fashions of the mid-18th century. Well, they got a hell of a gunk, I may tell yous, and there was a great commotion in the house. The skeleton was given a hasty Christian burial in a nearby churchyard. But old Lady Blackburn, it seems, hung onto the silk dress, as she didn't want to see it go to waste in a coffin. She got the servants to make cushions out of the material, and it seems she was very pleased with the result. She recorded in her diary that it made excellent cushions. Now, this was clearly a woman in no great sentiment or squeamishness. But afterwards, people remembered the story of the young lady who had been duelled over by two suitors, neither of whom survived the encounter. It was said now that they had agreed to lock the lady in a closet, and the victor of the duel was to free her and marry her. With both dead, neither came to free her, and since the whole business of the duel was a secret between them, no one even knew she was there. It was supposed now that she had starved to death in the closet. But surely she would have made some noise, banged on the door, called to be let out, shouted and screamed till someone in the household came and released her. This had not been the case. It all remained a mystery. Anyway, some said the ghostly lady still appears in the old castle ballroom, not to mention a ghostly dog which haunts the castle grounds. You have been listening to Miss Angel and the Dancer by Turlough Conmee from More Tales Told by a Dubliner.